Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, project of Scriptura. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 33. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of the psalm is going to have to deal with. And each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 33, the top 3 issues are the participles in verse 7, the meaning of the word kaned in verse 7, and the meaning of the word ki in verse 21. The first 2 issues both occur in verse 7, which reads in Hebrew as follows: Kones kaned me hayam noten beotzarot tehomot. The first issue concerns the 2 participles here, kones and noten, while the second issue addresses the possible interpretations of kaned. Regarding the 2 participles, at least 3 options exist. Consider, for example, the translations of the ESV, the NEB, and the NICOT commentary. In the ESV, we have, he gathers the waters of the sea as a heap, he puts the deeps in storehouses. In the NEB, we have, he gathered into a heap the waters of the sea, he laid up the deeps in his store chambers. Then in the NICOT commentary, we've got the one who gathers the waters of the sea like a wall, who sets up the deeps in vaults. As you can see, the 2 participles kones and noten here are rendered in 3 very different ways, with important implications for the broader meaning of these verses in the psalm. The first option, as we read in the ESV, is with present tense verbs. He gathers for kones and he puts for noten. The second option, as we read in the NEB, is with past tense verbs. He gathered and he laid up. Then the third option is to read these participles as nouns, referring to the one who gathers and the one who sets up the deeps. The first option, as present tense verbs, is chosen by many modern translations. It is not uncommon for participles to express a present tense action, and this interpretation is supported clearly by ancient witnesses like the Septuagint, which has the verbs synagon for kones and tithes for noten, both present active participles, which in Greek clearly imply present tense. Although this reading is plausible, there are a few issues with it. First, on a grammatical level, participles officially need an explicit subject, which is lacking here. However, on rare occasions, especially when functioning predicatively, we do find participles without an explicit subject, like in Genesis 32, verse 6, or verse 7 in Hebrew, or Psalm 34, verse 20, verse 21 in Hebrew, among other examples. The more important argument against this reading, though, is the way it would fit in its context. Both in verse 6, the verse immediately before, and in verse 9, 2 verses after, we have past tense katal and vayiktal verbs, creating a past tense time frame. In verse 6, we read about how the heavens and their host were made, na'asu, and in verse 9 about how God spoke, amar, and it was done, vayehi, and he commanded and it came about, again referring to God's past actions in creation. The message of this section seems to focus on God's past actions showing his power, and it seems most appropriate to read verse 7 also in this way. Here the references of kones kaned me hayam and noten beotzarot tehomot probably refer to the Exodus story, and possibly also to the Noah story in the flood, which are also mighty past acts of God. Reading these then as present tense verbs, he gathers and he puts, would be a strange shift out of this past tense context. Furthermore, and as we will see more clearly in the next issue, the 2 events described here are one-time events, referring probably, again, to the specific moment of God parting the sea in the Exodus, and possibly to the specific moment of God bringing the flood in the days of Noah. Reading these one-time past events then in the present tense creates a semantic mismatch, encoding a continuous or habitual meaning to a one-time past event. Now, against this contextual argument, some have said, well, maybe the psalmist is imagining himself in the past, as if he was witnessing for himself God's gathering of the waters and putting the deep oceans into storehouses. However, later in the psalm, it becomes clear the psalmist is very much focused on his present situation, not in a past situation, crying out to God for immediate help. You can see, for example, in verses 20 to 22. The second alternative then is to read these verbs as past tense actions, corresponding to the other past tense actions that we read about in verses 6 and 9. We saw this interpretation previously in the NEB's translation. He gathered into a heap the waters of the sea. He laid up the deeps in his store chambers. This reading has some ancient support. For example, Symmachus has here 2 past tense verbs, synegagen and apetheto, along with the Syriac peshita. This, however, is a less common use of participles, and even if it was the case, when participles are used in past tense time frames, they still encode a kind of continuous or habitual meaning, which again would be mismatched with these one-time events. Furthermore, this interpretation faces the same issue as the present tense option, in that it lacks an explicit subject for a verbal participle. Altogether then, this brings us to the third option of reading these 2 participles as nouns, that is, as substantive participles. We saw an example of this interpretation in the NICOT commentary, which has the one who gathers the waters of the sea like a wall, and the one who sets up the deeps in in vaults. This is a very common use of participles, and it's noteworthy that later in this very same psalm we have clear examples of participles functioning as nouns, just as we would have here. Take for example verse 15, which has hayotzer yahad libam hamevin el kol ma'asehem, where the definite article makes very explicit that yotzer, the one who made, and mevin, the one who understands, are nouns or substantival participles. This reading also resolves the problem of when the events of Psalm 33 verse 7 took place, because substantival participles do not encode when or how often events occur, only that they happen or did happen. The focus is instead upon the nature of the one who has done the action, which fits perfectly in the context of Psalm 33, which focuses centrally on the Lord's character and his saving power. It is best then to read this verse as describing the one who gathers the seawater as a heap, and the one who places the deep oceans into storehouses. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. We now come to the second issue in this verse, zooming in specifically on the second word here, kaned. There are at least three options for this word, as seen in the following three translations. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap, in the ESV, as he gathers the waters of the sea like a wineskin in the nets, following the Septuagint, and he gathers the waters of the sea into jars, as you have in the NIV. Does this word then refer to a heap, as in the ESV, a wineskin, as in the nets, reflecting the Greek Septuagint, or jars, as in the NIV? Let's begin with the second option of wineskins. This interpretation, which is not followed by almost any modern translations, is based on the Greek Septuagint, which has here sun agon hos askon hydata thalase, using the Greek word askos, meaning wineskin. This interpretation reflects an alternative reading of the original Hebrew, not as kaned, but as kinod, with an added silent aleph giving the word nod, the Hebrew word for wineskin. Beyond the support of the Septuagint, along with one possible witness in Qumran, a number of other arguments actually support this interpretation. First, it would match nicely with the corresponding word in the parallelism of this verse, otzarot, storehouses. As one scholar pointed out, both are enclosures within which the waters are placed by the Lord. Secondly, we have evidence elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible of storehouses and wine or water skins occurring together, as in Job 38 verse 22 and verse 37, which focuses on similar themes of God's sovereignty over water, although there the word is nevel, specifically a water skin, instead of nod, wineskin, as we would have here. Thirdly, we have another example of the Septuagint translating a similar phrase in the same way, in Psalm 78 verse 13, where the Hebrew reads Baka yam vaya'avirem vayatzev maim kimo ned, where the Septuagint also translates ned here with the word askos for wineskin. There are a number of specific issues, however, with this interpretation, and you can see our website for more detail on those. Despite all of this, the issue as a whole becomes quite clear when we compare this verse with Exodus 15 verse 8, which reads in Hebrew, Uvaruach apecha ne'ermu maim, nitzvu chemo ned nozlim, kaf'u tehomot belev yam. At the blast of your nostrils the waters piled up, the floods stood up in a heap, the deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. Here in the middle of the Song of the Sea, where Moses and Israel are celebrating God's miracle of the parting of the Red Sea, we read that the waters, the nozlim, nitzvu chemo ned, the floods stood up in a heap. The meaning of ned here, translated as a heap, refers to a kind of pile where the waters are stopped and pile up, as if against a wall. This description of waters piled up in a heap, using this word ned, appears throughout the Hebrew Bible, not just in Exodus 15:8 at the crossing of the Red Sea. The same phrase appears when Joshua led the people of Israel over the Jordan in Joshua chapter 3, and also, for example, in Psalm 78 verse 13, which we looked at previously. In fact, Psalm 78 verse 13 is a very helpful example, as the rest of the verse very clearly and explicitly references God's parting of the Red Sea, showing a good example of how it was common to look back at that moment of the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea and use the word ned to remind Israel of God's miracle. Although this verse in Psalm 33 does not reference this moment of the Exodus as explicitly as you would have in Psalm 78 verse 13, it is interesting to note, however, that throughout the psalm there are countless other references to the Exodus, and especially to Exodus chapter 15, the same chapter. See, for example, the keywords sus, horse, ruach, meaning breath or wind, hesed, loyalty, and tehom, deeps, which all occur in Psalm 33 and Exodus 15, along with many other thematic parallels, including, for example, victory in battle, plans of the nations, the Lord's supremacy over other gods, and fearing the Lord. Altogether, these echoes of the Exodus, and especially Exodus 15, build a strong connection to those texts, so it is most plausible that within this verse, we also have a reference to the Exodus and God parting the Red Sea, using this keyword nid. Now, for further details on this argument, as well as a description and engagement with the third interpretation of jars, you can see our detailed exegetical issue page on our website. However, the arguments presented here come together to show that the best way to understand this verse is with the Hebrew text kaned, like a heap. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a B+. Bringing these first two issues together then, we have translated verse 7 as follows. He is the one who gathers the seawater as a heap. He is the one who places the deep oceans into storehouses. The third issue in Psalm 33 comes towards the end in verses 20 and 21. Here, one small connecting word creates a major issue that leads to significantly different meanings. That word is ki, which joins these two verses together. We have here, Nafshenu hikta l'Adonai, Ezreinu umaginenuhu, ki vo yismach libenu, ki v'shem kodsho vatahnu. So in English, we would have, we ourselves wait longingly for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. Then the word ki, followed by our hearts rejoice in him, and then again ki, we have come to trust in his holy name. These two verses contain three basic ideas. First, the people's waiting on the Lord, nafshenu hikta l'Adonai. Then we have the Lord's protection, where the Lord is described as our help and our shield, Ezreinu maginenuhu. Then we have the third idea here, the people's joy and trust in the Lord, with the words of verse 21, our hearts rejoice in him and we have come to trust in his holy name. Addressing the meaning of ki here explores the relationship between these three ideas, and specifically around what causes what. Is the Lord's protection dependent on the people's joy and trust in him? Or is the people's waiting on the Lord dependent on the people's joy and trust in him? Or is it the other way around, and the people's joy and trust in the Lord is the result of the Lord's protection, or of their waiting on him? There are many variations and possibilities, but we can group most interpretations into three main options: causal, emphatic, and resultative. For a causal interpretation, take for example the ESV. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in him, because we trust in his holy name. In this case, ki is causal, providing the reason for what comes before it. The main driving force of this interpretation is that it follows by far the most common and default function of ki, which, when it follows a main clause, as we have here, it almost always provides grounds for that main clause, maybe as a necessary condition for it, a motivation for it, or any kind of reason or cause for what comes before. However, in the case of this verse, this causality or grounding can actually go one of two ways. The first is to understand that the Lord's protection, the words immediately before, he is our help and our shield, is grounded in, or in some sense caused by, the people's joy and trust in the Lord. This is one way of reading the ESV here, for example. He is our help and shield. In other words, he protects us for, or because, our heart is glad in him and we trust in his holy name. Now, this would be quite a radical statement, where the Lord's protection as help and shield are in some way dependent on or caused by the people's rejoicing and trust in him. Usually, in the Hebrew Bible, it's the other way around. Usually, God's people rejoice and trust in him because of his protection, because of his generous blessing. This is especially clear, for example, in Psalm 85, verse 7, which reads, "Will you not revive us again, or bless us, protect us, that, or in order that, your people may rejoice in you?" It would therefore be quite radical and striking to reverse this order here and say that the Lord's protection is instead a result of, or grounded in, his people's rejoicing and trusting in him. However, there is also a second way to read this ki here as causal without encountering this problem. This involves reading the second idea, the Lord's protection, he is our help and shield, as parenthetical. And it's actually the first idea, the people's waiting on the Lord, which is grounded in the people's joy and trust in the Lord. This makes much more sense and follows common patterns throughout the Hebrew Bible, similar, for example, to Psalm 42, verses 6 and 7, and Psalm 43, verse 5, among many others. But where then does that leave the second idea of the Lord's protection? As we said, it could easily be understood as a parenthetical statement, a kind of exclamation, and perhaps even also as part of the cause and the grounds for the first idea of waiting on the Lord. This seems to be the way that, for example, the Septuagint and the Peshitta understood this verse. The Septuagint gives us, "Hepsyche hemon hypomene to kurio, hoti boethos kai hyperaspistes hemon estin. Hoti enauto eufranthesetai hekardia hemon, kai ento nomati to hagio autu plisamen." Although the word hoti here in the second line seems to be supplied for clarification without any basis in the Hebrew, it makes clear sense to read essentially three reasons then for the main opening statement that we ourselves wait longingly for the Lord. 1, because he is our help and shield. 2, because our hearts rejoice in him. And 3, we have come to trust in his holy name. Or to restate it with our three main ideas, the people wait on the Lord because of his protection and because they rejoice and trust in him. This reading of key at the beginning of verse 21 is causal, grounding the first clause, we ourselves wait longingly for the Lord, with he is our help and shield being parenthetical, is then our preferred reading of this verse. However, there are many other interpretations and variations in how to read this verse. These are treated in great detail on our website resource page, along with many specific translations and variations. But it is important to at least briefly address two other interpretations, the emphatic and resultative options. The first is to read the key as emphatic, as mentioned above. Take, for example, the French NBS translation, which has Nous attendons le Seigneur, il est notre secours, notre bouclier. Oui, notre cœur se réjouit en lui. The word oui here essentially means yes or indeed, and it functions as an emphatic particle, used to create an exclamation. With this reading, the focus is no longer on causality, what causes what, trying to identify the source. The people's rejoicing and trust in the Lord is separated from what comes before it as its own independent exclamation. Now, the strength of this interpretation is that it does make sense in the context. An emphatic particle would imply simply that our hearts rejoicing in him is a well-accepted proposition for the audience, which certainly fits the context of the song of praise here. However, a survey of emphatic use of the key particle sheds some doubt on this interpretation here, especially compared with the strong evidence for the causal interpretation above, which we've shown, which follows the most common, by far, default usage of key. Certainly, sometimes the key particle can be used emphatically in this way, but the majority of the time that will be in the apodosis of a conditional clause or in an oath formula, neither of which are present here. The other interpretation worth mentioning is the resultative one, arguing that key here has the opposite of its normal causal function and is instead explaining the result or outcome of what comes before it. This would be something like, we ourselves wait longingly for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. Therefore, our hearts rejoice in him. This is based on a rare and disputed usage of key to express result instead of cause. And you can see our webpage for more detailed discussion and possible examples of this understanding. However, very few modern translations have adapted this view. It is possible that this view might be motivated, actually, by seeking to avoid the first causal reading that we mentioned above, where God's protection becomes grounded in or dependent on the people's rejoicing and trust in him. However, as we've seen with shifting the causality to focus on the first statement, with the Lord's protection being parenthetical, this does not actually need to be a major issue. To conclude then, we have chosen to translate Psalm 33 verses 21 and 22 as follows. We ourselves wait longingly for the Lord. He is our help and our shield, because our hearts rejoice in him, because we have come to trust in his holy name. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a B rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. So it is important to step back for a moment and see how each of these three issues affects the meaning of the entire psalm. With the first issue, focusing on the participles in verse 7, the issue at stake was the perspective of the psalmist on God's mighty acts. Were these acts just in the past, or happening in some way in the present? Or is the psalmist imagining himself in the past as witnessing them? We concluded that they are best read actually as nouns, substantival participles, focusing on God as the one who gathers the seawater as a heap, the one who places the deep oceans into storehouses. This substantive reading shifts the focus from exactly when these great acts took place to the power of God as the one who is able to do such mighty acts, both in the past and in the psalmist's and Israel's present struggles. The second issue was also in verse 7, where we clarified the meaning of the word kaned, showing it to refer specifically to God's parting of the Red Sea and gathering the waters up into a heap as he stopped them flowing. This anchored Psalm 33's reflection on God's power in the Exodus story, as in many other places throughout this psalm. The final issue considered the meaning of verses 20 and 21, and especially the logical connections expressed by the connecting particle key. There we concluded that it is most plausible to read Israel's commitment to wait longingly for the Lord as motivated both by the Lord's protection as their help and shield, and especially by the way their hearts rejoice in him, and they have come to trust in his holy name, as the one who gathers the sea waters as a heap, the mighty and great God who places the deep oceans into storehouses, among all his many mighty acts. This verse then brings together the themes of the psalm in a final expression of trust and praise. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 33, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the whole psalm and explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.